As you can see, I don't look very goth today. And the reason is that I'm doing the Naked Goth challenge. A challenge set forth by the Kilted Goth a little while back, and I wanted to do it because it sounds like an interesting exercise. So the idea is that you strip away everything that's outwardly goth about you, such as hair, makeup, clothing, trinkets, piercings, tattoos, any goth music you might be playing in the background, usually none of that. And then you think about what makes you a goth without all the external factors. So I've made a little list on my handy dandy iPad here, pardon me, about reasons why I think people will understand that I'm slightly offbeat or maybe even a goth, even if I were to walk down the street wearing all pink, like I am today, well, apart from purple socks. But yes. So my first point on this list is that ever since I was a very, very small kid, I've been the sort of person who would need to point out the possible negative outcome of any situation for me to be able to enjoy the more likely positive outcome of the situation. I don't know why I do this, but I always have, and I probably always will. So if you ever get to meet me in person and I suddenly talk about the worst possible scenario, that's the reason why. I just have to point it out so I can be happy. So yeah. I've also always been drawn to things that other people call weird and creepy and slightly dark and macabre. So in that I would include things like it was listed in a book I had when I was a kid called Mythologies, but it's not really mythology. The things like the Loch Ness Monster or mummies or the abominable snowman, stuff like that always fascinated me. I was scared of them, but they fascinated me. And also things like ghosts and ghost stories and what would happen if you were to meet a ghost, and supernatural things in that vein, and vampires and to some extent werewolves, all that stuff. Loved it since I was a very small child. And also to some extent the occult, but that was more like in Disney movies when you have a villain that's a witch, that sort of occult, like witchcraft, but Disney version witchcraft, because I was like 5. But yeah, things like that, and also slightly more macabre things, like I would be fascinated by finding a dead animal in the forest and like poking it with a stick and see what's underneath the skin and stuff. Good times. When it comes to like books and things I would read, I read a lot of Donald Duck comics when I was a kid and learned a lot about different things through that. But one of the main things was when I was about 8 and I was given a book series called Little Vampire. And I loved them. And I would always be more fascinated by the vampire than the little boy in the story, for whatever reason. So there is that. I also had a fairly large collection of Roald Dahl books. And I remember I would have these books read to me because I was a bit slightly too young to read them easily myself at this point. But I remember I was scared out of my wits by the witches, but I think I begged my parents to finish reading the book for me because I just had to know what happened to the witches. Didn't care about the other characters, just the witches. And also, as I mentioned in my previous video, here in Norway, goth appropriate or dark literature would include things like fantasy and sci-fi. So I would say that my love for the Narnia series when I was about 7-8 years old could be included in this because of that, but that might be different in other places in the world. I've also, for the longest time I can remember, had a fascination for, and therefore also the absence of fear of death. Again, I would poke dead animals with a stick to see what was underneath or inside them. It was nasty and creepy, but I just couldn't help finding out, okay, what happens when an animal dies? And a part of that is that when I was very, very young, I was told what happened. Both my parents are scientists, and I think that kind of helped, because I was never told that story about if your pet dies, it goes off to a colony and stays there forever, and it's just happy. I was told that when something dies, it, over time, turns to soil. And that idea really fascinated me in a way, because then I would, whenever I would find a dead animal in the forest, I would be like, oh, okay, so this has maybe gone 5 weeks into decomp, and this other one has gone maybe a couple of months into decomp, and see what the difference were. And things like that, kind of not what most kids were doing, but you know. And this, especially the absence of fear for death, was very much present when I was 10 and attended my grandfather's funeral. I wasn't afraid of death, but I didn't want to see him because I didn't want to remember him as this lifeless thing just laying there, as you do before you bury someone. And because I was just 10 years old, I didn't want to remember him like that. I wanted to remember the quirky old guy that I had grown up with. But at his funeral, I remember I didn't cry. And everyone around me did. And I just couldn't figure out why they would be so upset. Because to me, I just saw the whole thing as he could finally be at peace, because he was an old man, he had lived a long life, and he was very, very sick at the very end of his life, and had been sick for a while with other illnesses. So, in my mind, he was just now finally able to let go and be at peace. So I just didn't understand why people would cry. But again, a bit strange maybe for a kid to think like that, but you know. And if we talk about music, and I've excluded anything that's possibly typically goth music for this, but when I was very, very young, I remember my mom playing piano. She had been playing piano when she was younger as a hobby, and she was trained in classical piano. And she would play a lot of different things, but that also meant we had a lot of classical CDs and vinyl albums and things at our house. And whenever I would choose something to play, like a CD, I would typically go for something that was darker, something in a minor key, and some of the things I remember picking out and asking to put on was Bach and Beethoven. I know I had a fascination with I think it was Mozart's Requiem, and I discovered Verdi's Requiem later. But, you know, basically death music. And also a couple of works by Dvorak. I did like the other stuff too, like the happy-go-lucky things, but I just preferred the darker, more epic, more baroque, full-sounding things like Bach and Beethoven. So, and drawing that parallel to contemporary music, at least when growing up, whenever I would listen to something my peers would listen to, like pop music, I would try to seek out the darker songs or darker artists maybe, either by a song being in a minor key or the lyrics being of a certain darker theme, such as being depressed, the struggles of life, I don't know, lyrics about death and dying and being depressed about death and dying for a 8-year-old. Fun times. And even before that, when I was very young and would ask to put on other CDs, like not classical music but other types of music, it would be things that sounded a little darker to me. I remember loving Jethro Tull and Deep Purple when I was like 3 or 4 years old, and I still love both, especially Jethro Tull. For whatever reason, I always found him or that music to be very different than anything else I'd heard, but I couldn't understand why that was or what I was drawn to. It was just different. Because that is kind of the essence, in a sense. Wow. Because that is kind of what I'm getting at here, is that I've never been one to conform to any sort of norm in at least my country. I don't know what the norm would be other places, but at least when I was growing up in Norway, I was perceived as being different in any aspect. When I was very, very young, I would play more so with the boys than the girls in my street, and we would climb trees and play with Ninja Turtles and I don't know, video games. Legos was a big thing, and I was more interested in that sort of thing than Barbies and My Little Pony. That obviously changed a little over the course of several years, but I was always more drawn to the typical boys type things, however stupid that sounds. And in addition to that, I was a big old bookworm. I had a lot of books when I was a little kid, because I was a member of a book club that would send books to my home every month. I just loved it. And my peers, they weren't interested in books as much as I was. They wouldn't read as much as I did. They would prefer video games or TV. And while I also enjoyed that, I still spent a lot of my time reading books. So that is also kind of a weirdly nonconformist thing back in the 80s, early 90s here in Norway. So yeah. I would say I have a general preference for anything dark and macabre in any way, fashion or form, meaning the way I choose to decorate my home, the way I choose to present myself most days, the way or what I enjoy when it comes to movies and TV shows and music is typically darker oriented. I mean, I do really love like DC and Marvel movies and stuff like that as well. But I can honestly say that after having watched a couple of Marvel movies, say, I want to watch something scary and dark to balance it out. So, thinking about what I said in the previous video, that the geek culture kind of overlaps a bit with the goth culture here in Norway, being a complete nerd about Marvel things could be understood as a part of being nonconformist and a part of being different when I was growing up. But it's a bit of a discussion base, I think. My choice of high school is a typical example of being nonconformist, because here in Norway the system is such that you get to choose which high school you get to go to, if at all possible. You are asked to set up a list of priorities divided into 3. So you have 9 schools you apply to, essentially, well, kind of. So you list, at least in my time, you would list the type of studies. There was 3 you could choose from. So you could put in 3 different ones. You had to put in different ones. So my first one was general studies, which is what I ended up doing. And in general studies you had 3 schools you had to list. And then the second one down I think was art or something. Arts and media or whatever it was called. And 3 schools in that. And the last one I don't remember, but it was the same thing. 3 schools for that genre of studies. And I ended up going to my first choice, which was a Waldorf school, or a Rudolf Steiner school. And that's very much beside the norm here in Norway. It's very, very different than normal school. And even at that school, which was known as the freak school, I would try to be even more different than my classmates. So I would be even more freaky, or even more strange, or even more mysterious and weird, or do weird things, or read weird books in class. All this stuff, just to be slightly different than everyone else, because I've always seen myself as very much an individual. And there's no one like me on the planet. I've always thought of myself like that. And I've always kind of tried to emphasize that notion by being different all the time. Let's see. Yeah. Ever since I was a little kid, when it came to humor and things I would enjoy and laugh at, I don't know if I've talked about this before to some extent, but on TV when I was a kid, there was a lot of Monty Python. And I grew up watching Monty Python, Allo Allo, and I don't remember if it aired on TV or not, but I remember I had been exposed to Blackadder. So my humor from a very, very, very early age on was kind of weird, and a lot of the times very sarcastic, very dark, and sometimes just downright morbid. And I also loved Poirot. It was my favorite TV show when I was a kid, and I was allowed to watch it. I remember being like 4 or 5, watching Poirot on a Friday night, because it aired on TV every Friday night for a good chunk of years. And I just loved it. I liked the feel of it. I liked the quirkiness of Hercule Poirot. and I liked how everything looked. It was very like semi-Victorian in a way, and I just really loved it. So my shirt that I'm wearing is a prime example of my sometimes kind of offbeat humor. I'll try to show you without tipping over. It says, "Hello Schrödinger." Yeah. Some of you may know what that is. Some of you may not. So I will link a Wikipedia article in the box below so you can read up on Schrödinger and what he did and why this, to me, is hella funny. So I do believe that is all I can think of, or all I could figure out, that weren't directly linked to the goth bands I listened to or the clothing I chose to wear or things like that. So I think what I'm trying to say is that being nonconformist in any sort of understanding of the word, no matter how you dress, might let people think that I'm either just weird or possibly a goth. I'm hoping they think I'm a goth, but you never know what people think. So, bye!